Well, I don't think you're going to have any trouble hearing me, but you might have some trouble seeing me. Anybody here have a phone book? Can you see me back there? Can you see me? All right. I thought she was coming up with a phone book. Well, what I want to talk to you today, I wanted to offer you some images from debates in the 1960s, and some of you younger people think that the debates in the 1960s are old hat. They are, in fact, very live. Just in the last few weeks, I myself, at this campus, with the Hillel House here, reenacted in some ways the conflict that I wanted to be addressing you today. A number of weeks ago, I have a friend who was a Nobel Peace Prize nominee activist, Israeli activist, who rebuilds Palestinian houses demolished by the state of Israel unjustly. He's an anti-occupation activist, an Israeli. He was a corporal in the army. I and a few student groups approached the Hillel, and we were told that he would not be welcome to speak. This activist, Jeff Halpert, he himself actually was the first rabbinic student in the late 1960s to burn his draft card. Moved to Israel, became an educator, and later an organizer. I said, okay, Hillel doesn't want to bring a Nobel Peace Prize nominee, a good guy. I understand they're a little nervous, maybe by the end of the year we'll have him back. The next week, the Hillel House then brought in F.E.A. Tom, former member of Knesset, a guy who moved back to Gaza in order to try and prevent the withdrawal out of Gaza a few years ago, initiated by Ariel Sharon. Somebody who is the farthest right-wing possible speaker. You could bring both comparable ages, both emerged out of the 1960s, both had a different trajectory politically as Jews, understanding their Judaism and their activism coming out of what they understand Judaism to be. These same debates were happening in Jewish theology in the 60s, and I just wanted to give you a taste of some of the fascinating figures in American Jewish Muslim. We're talking about elite discourse here. We're talking about theologians, writers, professors of philosophy, white Ashkenazi Jews. Our three principals, all from Germany. That's as Ashkenazi as you can get. Many of you probably know about Abraham Joshua Heschel. You've seen that iconic picture of him marching with Martin Luther King Jr. and Selma with those leis or whatever it is around their necks. Heschel has become, for the organized Jewish community, the image of a mythic story of black Jewish cooperation. That the Jewish community was right there with King in the figure of the prophetic Heschel. Heschel, a Hasidic Jew philosopher who moves from Eastern Europe to America, whose book, The Prophets, was on the required reading list of many of the seminary students who marched with King. Heschel, who addressed a conference on religion and race in 1963 and met then Martin Luther King. At that conference, Heschel said something like this, opening his speech: the first conference on religion and race was held in Pharaoh's court. He goes on to say in thunderous tones and prophetic discourse that racism is an eye disease and that the Jewish community needs to do something about this. This is a time not for half-stepping, but for radical action. King, impressed with Heschel and also knowing his writings on the prophets, then collaborates with him over several projects. They speak in each other's presence over the years. And today, as I mentioned, Heschel is seen as iconic, as representing. The Jewish community is super proud of Heschel, that there was a Heschel, prophetic-looking, long beard, marching with King. But at the time, he was marginalized. His colleagues counseled him that he should not be working with this rabble-rouser king. People in the Jewish community, Southern rabbis, counseled him that this was not a good idea. He was not representing the community well. I am standing on my tippy toes and getting tired, so. LJ need a phone. Well, unlike my colleagues here have been very supportive of political activity, Heschel was not quite welcomed and seen as an oddball, even in the halls of Jewish Theological Seminary. But Heschel's position, as noble, courageous, and important as it was not the only position taken by rabbis, by philosophers, by activists in the 60s around the issues of civil rights, and I want to introduce you to several others, one from the far left, and one from the far right, and another who put a question mark around. I want to tell you about Stephen Schwarzschild. Anyone here heard of Stephen Schwarzschild? You know some of his relatives, because his niece lives here in Philadelphia, and in fact she was outside of the Hillel protesting Effie Tom last week. Stephen Schwarzschild is somebody we should all know. He was a German-born rabbi. He was first ordained Reform and then later joined as well the conservative movement and was the only rabbi to hold membership in both the Reform and conservative rabbinical associations. Stephen Schwarzschild understood himself as part of the tradition of Marburg Neo-Kantianism, a disciple of a philosopher who you should also know, Hermann Cohen. Schwarzschild was an influential figure in American Jewish letters. He edited the journal Judaism during a very important time in its history. He proceeded over the conference that really articulated what we now know to be what we now call today the Holocaust, a very important conference in the late 60s. He was a teacher of many important Jewish philosophers, et cetera, et cetera. Let me tell you a little bit about his thought. Schwarzschild held that Judaism was essentially a cluster of attitudes one takes towards the world, positions that one takes towards the world. You see the world as radically unfinished. You see the world as changeable. And you see a vocation that God is calling you to transform the world against its imperfect, unjust, and overall terrible conditions. That Judaism was about being active in the world, that Judaism and overall terrible conditions. That Judaism was about being active in the world, that Judaism was a system of rendering the world complete, about working for justice. He was so insistent on this point, a sort of tradition of Jewish rationalism, that he held even figures like Karl Marx and Spinoza, erstwhile radical Jews, as really conservatives. They were conservatives because Marx was a conservative, because he had a determinist picture of the world, where everything was moving in a sort of direction that even without agency or will, it would go the way it was. That Spinoza cut off all possibilities for agency because he said that the world in some ways was determined. In contrast, Schwarzschild saw the world as radically unfinished, and importantly, aligned himself in his ideas with certain political movements. He declared that he himself and that all good Jews should be vegetarians, pacifists, and democratic socialists. He believed that pacifism was essential to Judaism, and that reading against the grain of the rabbis and the received tradition of Judaism, even Heschel was not a pacifist, that Judaism was essentially about a pacifist position. Now, as with most pacifists I have known, his rhetoric was quite violent and militant. I want to offer you some of that. Now, Schwarzschild was also aligned with the various political movements, of course, the anti-war movement. But one thing very interesting was that his reactions to the Black Power movement were reactions that one often does not hear in mainstream establishment Jewish circles. Consider this quote from a contribution to the late 60s Symposium on Blacks and Jews. And he called this ethics, and I call this paper, the ethics that issues forth from where Africa and Asia conjoin. The ethics from where Africa and Asia conjoin. He says, the people of Israel are chosen as a specific instrument through which the kingdom is to be brought about, and who therefore labor under responsibilities not imposed on anyone else. Blacks and other oppressed groups are entirely right when they expect immensely higher standards of behavior from Jews than from anyone else. Rather than expect to be treated with reciprocal respect or to see Jewish suffering as comparable and worthy of Black sympathy, Schwarzschild bucked conventional wisdom by insisting that Jews must act regardless of the response of the other. Here's what he says. Israel is not in this game on a tit-for-tat basis. Were this the case, we would have had to abandon the striving for mankind's good life a long time ago. We must continue to enact an attitude of complete color blindness and a dedication to the total abolition of social injustices, regardless of the cost to us. He went on to say, the civil rights movement and Messianic Judaism are at one, in that their aim is not delayed and partial, but complete and immediate. We are committed, body and soul, to the good society, all of it here and now and everywhere. Action, both individual and collective, is imperative, total, revolutionary action. The Jewish program must therefore be, in effect, messianic. There's no compromising with Schwarzschild. One lived one's life as if in messianic times. Vegetarian, pacifist, socialist. This reaction was quite different, as we heard from Jane, from the segments of the Jewish population who reacted to the aggressiveness of the Black Power, some parts of the Black Power movement, with disdain, sort of disillusionment over the Black freedom struggle. In contrast, Schwarzschild saw criticisms of anti-Semitism as having some warrant, and that it's not up to Jews to base their activities and alliances with the virtues or exaggerations of the groups that they are called upon to help out with. And this conception of Judaism also harbors very interesting implications, which I want to talk about at the end. One, that Judaism is an attitude and a stance, has almost nothing to do with genetics or biology or stock. And in this way, he said that somebody like Kant or Jean-Paul Sartre were Jews. You didn't have to be Jewish to be Jewish. You just have to enact a radical program of world transformation, social justice, and a sense of the world as incomplete and yet changeable, never quite getting to that messianic, perfect society. His messianic ethics, this call for radical revolution, a rethinking and reweaving of all the world, put him in opposition to things like nature, natural law, and he's talk of natural or material reality that was resistant to change. This was a conception of Judaism that was idealistic and without, maybe unrecognizable to many of us today. On another side, we have another sort of moment in Jewish theology articulating at the same time. I would just want to say a few words about what you might call the right-wing side of Jewish theology. And that is in the figures also both the German Jewish immigrants, Emil Fackenheim and Michael Vissergrad. Emil Fackenheim is quite well known, very influential today. I'm working on a piece that actually talks about the latest Heidegger controversy in relationship to Fackenheim. Fackenheim, who coined the phrase, you heard it before from Lily, that Jews are commanded not to give Hitler any posthumous victories. Have you heard this phrase before? Jews are not allowed to give Hitler any posthumous victories, and that means for Fackenheim that Jews have to survive. They have to survive at all costs, that the state of Israel has to be guarded, that the state of Israel is the form of resistance to Jewish nothingness, nihilism. And that all people have to be Zionists. All people have to work for the security of the state of Israel. This was an empowering, energizing theology that emerged out of Fackenheim's reaction to the Holocaust and a conference that Schwarzschild himself convened in the late 60s, but later drifts as Fackenheim, who settles in Toronto, moves to the state of Israel and ends up the very political movements that F.E.A. Tam represents. He supported the very right-wing settler movement. He saw all the land of Israel as Jewish land. He believed that Israel was exclusively for the Jews and Arabs that would accept the Jewish state and the Jewish presence without criticism. He praised as heroic the settler movement for its resistance to being uprooted and demonized by the Palestinian liberation movement. And in fact, he saw Judaism as a material thing of bodies and survival. Thing of bodies and survival. In a similar way, Michael Vissergrad, another theologian, emerges out of this time period, taking stands on political issues for the war in Vietnam, and it's good for the Jews. Also held that Jews were essentially about bodies, that the bodies, the corporate, carnal structure of Jews was in itself holy, that the doings and strivings and the well-beings of Jews was crucial. And ensuring their survival was an act of holiness. Vissergrad was not as politically conservative or right-wing as Fackenheim, but you have two different tendencies. On one hand, you have Schwarzschild saying that the bodies of Jews, in some way, it doesn't matter. It's the virtues of Jews, it's the attitude of Jews, the stance of Jews. And on the other hand, you have Fackenheim and Vissergrad saying that what matters is the bodily survival of Jews, playing the numbers game, playing the issues of survival, and seeing the Black Power movement as a threat to Jewish survival, seeing the Palestinian liberation movement as a threat to the very bodies of Jews. These have analogs and implications. I want to sketch out a few and maybe save some time for questions. Since only one of my undergraduate students are here, I'm kind of cagey about revealing my own personal politics about this. So you can ask me and try to get out of me later. But one of the implications of this is that you have these radical alternatives to Heschel's position, which, relatively speaking, seems quite moderate. On one hand, the Jews have to sort of be subordinate to any sort of criticism by groups perceived to be oppressed. On the other hand, Jews have to be aggressive and militant. And you see this coming out of the politics. You have an Abby Hoffman, for example, who I think would agree with Schwarzschild and said in an interview that the meaning of being Jewish was being the kid in the corner who says that the emperor has no clothes on. It meant being the prophet. It meant being the voice of social justice. It did not mean being to a synagogue or living in a state of Israel. Actually, Abby Hoffman was prevented from going to the state of Israel. Everybody remember that? And Hoffman was actually prevented as a Jew from traveling there. And on the other hand, you have Meir Kahane. Kahane, a Brooklyn-born Jew who moves to Israel. Before he moves to Israel, however, he starts a group called the Jewish Defense League, who purposely targeted the Black Power movement for its perceived racism, criticizing its anti-Zionism. And their slogan was, "Every Jew at 22." That they would militantly defend Jewish bodies from black crime, black criminality, and anti-Zionism. Kahane moves to Israel, starts the Koch Party, which is actually outlawed by the state of Israel as a racist party. And if you read Never Again or other of Kahane's writings, you see echoes and family resemblances to the works of Fackenheim, to the works of Vissergrad, that talks about the Jewish body as a holy site meant to be defended at all costs, that blacks had to be subordinate and chastened in light of the need for Jewish survival, that the world itself had to be brought into line with a sort of irredentist Zionist agenda. These philosophical debates are still with us. They emerge in issues of gatekeeping, who can speak in the Hillel, who cannot, what a proper Jewish attitude is to the state of Israel, the reaction to the Black Power movement, to radical movements in Latin America. These concerns, though philosophical and in the realm of elite discourse, trickle down today. How many sermons have used the words of Fackenheim versus those of Schwarzschild? How much of the Jewish establishment has used Heschel, defanged Heschel, made him saintly, made him non-radical in order to cover up problems within the Jewish community and blind spots within the Jewish community's political agenda? I'll end there. Thank you.